Manifest Destiny. So now we start on a unit about the growth of the United States, about the physical growth of the United States. And the physical growth of the United States started almost as soon as the United States declared independence in 1776. Of course, after that time, when America won its independence with the Battle of Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris 1783, the United States acquired the land over the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, which Americans had been moving onto even before they had declared independence. And as more and more Americans moved over the mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, towards the Mississippi River, there became a sort of a shared belief, a common idea called manifest destiny, that it was the destiny, it was the future. Manifest means clearly seen. The clearly seen future of the United States is stretched from sea to shining sea, to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Now, as we'll see, we call this expansion many different things in American history. Sometimes we call it westward expansion, sometimes we call it U.S. expansion, sometimes we call it manifest destiny. And sometimes all of those names leave some things to be desired. You might call it westward expansion, except actually the United States was expanding north and south, and actually a little bit east as well. But we'll look at how the United States expanded basically through four major ways. So the United States expanded through purchases, that is by buying land. The United States expanded through treaties, basically through diplomatic efforts, oftentimes with other countries. The United States expanded through warfare and conquest. And the United States expanded through relocation of people, through moving people from one area to another area. So these are the four major methods by which the United States expanded: purchase, treaties, war, and relocation of people. And already in our course, we have some examples of some of those ways the United States expanded. So the Louisiana Purchase, notice the purchase part. So we acquired the Louisiana Territory through a purchase with France in 1803 for $15 million that doubled the size of the United States overnight. The Louisiana area, as you may remember, all came about because the United States was anxious, was wanting that port of New Orleans as a gateway from American farmers who were planting crops west of the Appalachian Mountains. They were using the river system to float their crops down to New Orleans, and then in New Orleans put them on big sailing ships and ship them to the East Coast and around the world to sell. And that's why New Orleans became so important. As you may remember, the Americans offered to buy New Orleans and a little bit of land east of it, but Napoleon made a counteroffer and sold New Orleans and basically all the French acquisitions, all of the French lands to the west of it for $15 million under Thomas Jefferson. So one way the United States expanded was through purchase, by buying the land from another country. In this case, we purchased it from France. And nobody actually knew how far north the Louisiana Purchase went and how far west it went. Everyone knew that it started at the Mississippi River, but there had never been any real diplomacy between France and other countries to determine where the border of the French Louisiana Purchase area was. So when that area was sold to the United States, there was no hard or fast rules about where the northern border was or where the western border was. So some Americans thought the Louisiana border stretched all the way into Canada and all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Whereas another way the United States acquired land was by treaty. In this case, in 1819, it was a treaty with Florida that gave us what had been Spanish. I'm sorry. We made a treaty with Spain in order to get Spanish Florida. That area had been Spanish for over 300 years, basically since the 1500s. And as I already mentioned, by the early 1800s, there were not many Spaniards in Florida, but there were a lot of different Indian groups and a lot of, in some cases, pirates. And those pirates and Indian groups often attacked into the United States. And as a result of that, you may remember that Andrew Jackson led a part of the Army, the United States Army, a militia force, down into Florida and basically took it over from the Spanish. But the United States gave that area back to the Spanish because, of course, taking over another country's area without permission is an act of war. But nevertheless, after giving that area back to Spain, the United States had warned Spain that if those bandits raids and those Indian raids continued, that the next time Andrew Jackson exceeded his authority and took over Florida, we weren't going to give it back. So Spain realized that they were probably going to lose Florida pretty soon anyway, and so they decided to try to get something out of it. And in 1819, the Spanish ambassador to the United States, Onassis, signed a treaty with our Secretary of State, Adams, called the Adams-Onassis Treaty, which secured Florida for us. In exchange, the United States promised, or basically said, the Louisiana Purchase area did not take in Spanish Texas. And the Adams-Onassis Treaty also basically drew a border of where basically California would stop. Now, of course, there was some money exchanged during the treaty in Florida, but of course that money was given by the United States government to U.S. citizens who had suffered loss from those raids, from the Indian raids and pirate raids from Florida. And so the Spanish did not get any money, but they did get basically the U.S. pledge that Texas was part of Spanish territory and not part of the Louisiana territory like some Americans had thought. So even though in some places you might read there's an exchange of $5 million, again, Spain did not get any money for Florida from the United States. Instead, that $5 million was given by the United States to its own citizens to pay off lawsuits they had filed against Spain. But nevertheless, in 1819, the United States acquires Florida by treaty with the Spanish. Now, of course, in Florida, there were Indian groups, and those Indian groups were not at all happy that there had been a land exchange between the United States and Spain. The United States basically tried to get the Indians from Florida to move, and although some, what we now know as Seminole Indians, did move, others simply tried to stay in Florida. In the very same way as in Georgia, the United States had tried to get the Cherokees to move by offering them land in the West and offering them basically some financial inducements, some money, basically money to help move. But of course, again, many of those Cherokees decided to stay put on their land. Of course, in Georgia, the United States government passed the Indian Removal Act, which gave Jackson and later his vice president, or new president, Martin Van Buren, the right to use the U.S. Army in case the Cherokees did not agree to the treaties. And so eventually the U.S. Army was called out, and those Indians did move. But along the trail, along the route the Army planned, which they did not plan too well, about 1 out of 4 Cherokees died before they actually got to the other side of the Mississippi River, sometimes called the Trail of Tears. Something similar happened in the Seminoles in Florida. When the Seminoles and other Indian groups refused to move, the United States Army went in. There are some sort of rather bloody campaigns. many of the Seminoles sort of hid out in the jungles and sort of swamps in Florida, so it's very difficult to find them, to even fight them. So eventually, most of the Seminoles were moved, either because they volunteered to move or because they were forcibly moved, though there was still a small group that never left Florida because the U.S. Army basically couldn't find them to drive them out, sometimes called the Seminole Wars. So this is part of what we might call relocation of people, moving people from one place to another place so basically the United States can take their land. So far we've looked at examples of how the United States has grown through treaties, that is Spain, we got Florida, how the United States has grown through purchase of the Louisiana Purchase from France, and how the United States has grown through relocation of people, the Trail of Tears and the Seminole Wars. Now we turn our attention to more land in the West, a place called Oregon, along the west coast of what's now the United States. By the early 1800s, four nations actually claimed that land that we now know as Oregon. Great Britain claimed the land because one of their ships, in fact, I believe it was one of Captain Cook's ship, the discoverer, that is the first European to run across Hawaii, had sailed his ship up and had found the outlet of the Columbia River and claimed that river for Britain. And of course, Canada was nearby, and that was British territory. Then from the south, the Spanish claimed the Oregon Territory because the Spanish ruled California, and they believed that California went all the way up basically into what we know as Canada. Then from the north, Russia claimed Oregon. The Russians, at that time owning Alaska, basically claimed that Russia, Alaska, went all the way down into California. And then, of course, the United States claimed Oregon because of the explorations of Lewis and Clark, and of course, their good friend Sacagawea. So you have four nations all claiming the same land. Now, of course, normally when you just have two nations claiming the same land, that's really not good, and that can often lead to war. Now you have four nations claiming the same land, and that's sort of like a recipe for some type of violent outbreak. However, that violent outbreak did not occur. And looking at the Oregon country, you can see from the south, Mexico or the Spanish territory, and from the western, the United States and the British, and basically from the northern, it doesn't say Russia up there, but the Russians are also claiming that area. So several things happened. One, in 1819, Spain dropped its claim to this area in the Adams-Onasis Treaty. The Spanish were having trouble enough just keeping California, and they realized that they would have little or no control north of California. And as it turned out, of course, in just a couple of years after they signed the treaty, the Spanish were, well, no longer around in North America because Mexico took over for them. Then in 1824, Russia dropped its claim to Oregon because basically Russia had its hands busy, so to speak, in basically trying to run Alaska and the settlements that went along with Alaska, and they were basically busily hunting seals and seal furs in Alaska. That left the United States and the United Kingdom and Great Britain to fight about Oregon, except for the fact that since this is after the War of 1812, the good news is in the War of 1812, even though technically no one won or lost, actually both sides won because there was a clause in the peace treaty, a part in the peace treaty that said from now on, if the United States and Britain have problems with each other, instead of fighting about it, they'll sit down and talk about their problems. So this is one of the instances that Britain and the United States sat down and talked about their problems, and they decided that because there were so few people in Oregon at the moment, that they would wait 10 years. That they would basically see where people from America moved into Oregon and where people from Britain moved into Oregon, And then later, they would talk about dividing Oregon, depending upon where the people from Britain were and the people from America were, the people from the United States were. And so for basically a period of 10 years, they agreed that they basically would not fight over Oregon, but they would basically share Oregon peacefully and jointly administer it. Now, there were very few Americans in Oregon. Of course, Lewis and Clark had come first. But one of the things they reported when they arrived back was that there were a lot of course, good mountains near Oregon, but there's a lot of fast-flowing rivers and a lot of beavers as well in those mountains and by those fast-flowing rivers. And for many Americans, beavers meant furs. And at the time, there's a fur craze in Europe. And so beaver pelts were highly priced. They were greatly wanted in Europe to basically make clothing. And of course, when you say beaver furs or other animal furs, we're not actually talking about the hair that's on the outside that we often think of the fur. It's the inner layer of the fur that actually the Europeans prized and made into things like shirts and pants and coats and hats and other things like that, because the inner layer of the fur, especially beaver furs, were basically water resistance. They had a nice sheen on them. In many ways, they were like silk, except they were water resistant. And so beaver furs brought in a big price because Europeans wanted them for their clothing industry. And eventually, about 3,000 Americans moved into Oregon to hunt these beavers. Now, they're oftentimes called mountain men, although to give credit where credit's due, there were at least a few mountain women as well. But this was an undeveloped area. There were no cities or towns. Basically, you were out on your own. And usually trappers were on their own or in very small groups of 3 or 4 people, trapping beavers for most of the year. And then during the summer months, spring and summer months, they would come down from the mountains and they would take their beaver furs that they had trapped, and they brought their beaver furs down to basically where the Columbia River met the Pacific Ocean, and some trading ships would come up, and those trading ships would then trade these fur traders, these mountain men, what they needed. So the mountain men would trade the furs and give them beaver furs, and whether they were British or American ships, the American ships could offer, handmade weapons or guns. They could offer metal parts and hooks that mountain men could not make. They could offer many. They could offer handmade clothing. They could offer clothing and other things the mountain men did not have. And so the mountain men resupplied themselves in what's called a rendezvous. They would rendezvous. They would meet basically once a year down by the coast. Now, eventually, one American, John Jacob Astor, who was basically from New York, who had been sort of in the fur business in the Great Lakes region, he heard about the mountain men, and instead of sending a ship once a year, he decided it might be a good idea to basically start a little settlement in Oregon. And that settlement, the mountain men could come down any time of the year and bring their furs to trade. And so John Jacob Astor started that little fur trading post, which was named after him, still there today, called Astoria, which, by the way, is a setting of some fine feature films. The Goonies, for one, or Kindergarten Cop for another. There's been several films that have been filmed in Astoria, Oregon. Very nice place. Now, John Jacob Astor would eventually make a lot more money from his fur trading business in Oregon and would put that money into real estate in New York. So eventually, the Astors became extremely wealthy. So eventually, one of John Jacob Astor's descendants was able to afford a high-priced ticket on the most luxurious, richest ship afloat to cross the Atlantic. Unfortunately, that ship, named the Titanic, struck an iceberg, and the descendant of John Jacob Astor, also named John Astor, died in the Titanic. So sometimes money doesn't buy you everything. It certainly did not buy him a place on the lifeboat. Having said that, Astoria was a very important fur trading post because now the American presence in Oregon was firmly established. These mountain men, who were mostly American, would now come down and trade, and this, because it was an American trading post, basically that was sort of cutting the British out of that area of Oregon. The second group of Americans to Oregon were the missionaries. So the mountain men would often tell stories to the people of Astoria or to the ships that came by, and those ships would then take mail and their stories, the mountain men stories, back to places like New York City, back to the East Coast, and some of their stories concerned Indians in Oregon. And the Christians back on the East Coast decided to start sending out missionaries to Christianize the Indians in Oregon. So some of the first missionaries, they weren't the first missionaries, but certainly the first man and woman missionary to cross the Rocky Mountains. In fact, Narcissus was the first woman to cross the Rocky Mountains, a European woman that we know about. They came to Christianize the Indians in 1836 and started a little mission near what is now Walla Walla, Washington today. And for the first year, whatever, it went well, but then it turns out they brought disease with them. They brought the measles, and the Indians had no immunity to measles. The Indians had never experienced measles before, which means they had no antibodies to the measles. So once the measles hit the Indians, it was worse than COVID. It was worse than a plague. The measles just spread from Indian to Indian very quickly, and because they had no antibodies, the measles tended to quickly overwhelm the immune systems and kill the Indians. Young kids sometimes get measles, and they have a rough few days and get out of it. Of course, oftentimes we're vaccinated almost from birth to measles, but it can kill, and it did kill Indians. In fact, the Indians were so mad that a year later they went to the mission and basically attacked the mission, killing the Whitmans in the process and burning down the missions for bringing the disease with them. Although more Christian missionaries arrived, those Christian missionaries wrote letters back home, not just about the Indians, but also how fertile the land was, how good the land was for growing. And Americans back east remembered that. They remembered that when they had some economic troubles. In 1837, there was the Panic of 1837. You may remember from our course that Andrew Jackson had vetoed the Bank of the United States bill, which basically killed the Bank of the United States, which basically meant that the economy quickly collapsed. Well, not quickly, but almost as soon as Jackson left office, the economy collapsed because of what he had done in office. Jackson didn't get the blame for the collapse of his vice president, Martin Van Buren, because Van Buren was actually in office when the economic collapse arrived. And many people refer to it as Martin Van Ruin. They refer to him as Martin Van Ruin because he ruined the economy. Those actually Jackson's actions actually ruined it. But nevertheless, so there were economic troubles in the East. People were losing their land. They were losing their businesses, and they were looking for places to go. Now, of course, you learned last year one place they went is GTT, gone to Texas. So thanks to this economic panic in 1837, that many Americans came to Texas immediately after the Texas Revolutionary War. We had great immigration in Texas because of that. But many other people didn't GTT, they GTO'd. They'd gone to Oregon. So because Americans had heard about the very fertile land out there, when these economic troubles hit, they decided to basically go to Oregon. And again, by this time, many Americans were thinking, anyway, this is our destiny, this is our future anyway. We're supposed to basically go out west. We're supposed to move to the Pacific Ocean. We're supposed to basically have this entire continent from the East Coast to the West Coast under our control. So many Americans bought into this idea that it was sort of their God-given duty or God-given right even to move west and take land and basically move all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Fortunately, for that, there was actually a little trail, a route you could take. And since it was going to Oregon, it's called the Oregon Trail. So you can see the Oregon Trail basically left Missouri from Independence. Basically, Independence was the last place that the steamboats went to. So basically, you took if you're in the East Coast, you took the railroads basically to St. Louis, and then you took the steamboats to Independence. And then on the steamboat at Independence, Missouri, you took what money you had from, maybe selling your farm or selling your business or whatever money you had left from your bankruptcy, and you got on one of these wagon trains. Oftentimes entire families would come, and they put all the money they had into buying a wagon and buying supplies to basically go across the continent, more or less along the red line, although the trail was not really one trail. It was sort of a multitude of trails that sort of overlapped. So the trail sort of changed from year to year, but it's very similar. Maybe a few miles apart every year, maybe 5 or 10 or 20 miles apart. But nevertheless, it sort of followed the red line. And eventually, you would move over the Rocky Mountains and hopefully into Oregon City and get that wonderful, awesome, good land for yourself. The Oregon Trail from Independence to basically Oregon City, basically what we now know is, for example, places like Portland or Eugene or whatever, was about 2,000 miles. I think it's like 2,174 miles if memory serves correct, but a few people had been going over this trail for a while. Of course, some of the missionaries had gone over this trail, and it usually took anywhere from 4 to 6 months to make the journey. And basically, you're going to walk all the way. Certainly, you might have a wagon, but as we'll see, the wagons were basically storage areas. They were there for your food and to basically take all the stuff that you had with you. So there was very little room in the wagon. Besides which, according to every guidebook and every settler account we had, most of these wagons, the ride was so it was such a terrible shock to your physical body as the wagon bumped along that was easier to walk the entire distance. So the first large group that left Independence, Missouri, of over about 1,000 people left in 1843 and made it successfully over the Rocky Mountains to Oregon City. It was sometimes called the Great Migration of 1843 because basically it's the first large-scale wagon train that went through the Oregon Trail and made it successfully to Oregon. So from about 1843, and again, of course, the settlers were leaving before 1843. Certainly by thanks to the Panic of 1837, you had more and more Americans making the trip every day. However, it's estimated from 1843, basically from 1840 to 1870, about 400,000, maybe 500,000 people traveled the Oregon Trail. But sometimes they didn't all travel to Oregon, because the Oregon Trail often had offshoots, much like our roads today. You can take the main road, but then there's other roads you can go down off the main road. So off the Oregon Trail, you go to California along the California Trail, or you go to Salt Lake, the Great Salt Lake, along the Great Salt Lake Trail, sometimes called the Mormon Trail, or you can go to Montana through the Montana or the Bozeman Trail. But nevertheless, that is a large number of people moving west. And as we will see, the journey in some cases was pleasant, and in other cases was not so pleasant at all. So about 90% of the people who made the journey were successful, which means about 40,000 of them died. That may not seem successful to you, but it seems successful to the people involved. About 30,000 of the 40,000 died of disease. And there were multiple diseases, as we'll learn as we look into the subject more carefully. Besides the diseases, there were also amazingly many accidental discharges of firearms. And if that did not account for hundreds of deaths, it's probably accounted for a couple of thousand deaths. Firearms back then were somewhat notoriously unreliable. They did not have like safety locks on them or safety mechanisms like our firearms do today. And they often discharged if they were loaded, and they discharged. Sometimes you didn't have to pull the trigger. Sometimes if the gun just bumped something, it would discharge, and sometimes it would discharge into you. And so there were a lot of accidental gunshots along the trail. Of course, certainly not as many diseases. Interesting enough, there weren't many deaths because of Indian attacks. The Indians, as we'll see, were pretty peaceful at the time and were actually pretty happy to see the settlers because the Indians were making money off the settlers in many different ways. So really the last thing the Indians wanted to do was to attack their money supply. So, you know, in some parts of the world, even today, when you travel those parts of the world and people find out you're American, they're really happy to see you because to them, Americans mean money. To them, all Americans are rich. And of course, you and I probably don't consider ourselves rich, but in many places in the world, they do consider us rich, and so they just see a big money sign on us. And apparently the Indians were quite like that. They saw these Western people from the United States coming, and to them, they just saw big money signs, and ooh, you make money off these people. So there weren't many people, especially in the early years of the Oregon Trail, being killed by Indians. So probably about, for every mile of the Oregon Trail, probably 10 to 15 people died over this 30-year period or so. And again, that seems like a lot, but we have to remember that this was before sort of modern transportation. And remember, they had steamboats in the east. They didn't have steamboats to Oregon. You could take a ship to Oregon, usually a sailing ship, but it was extremely expensive. And the sailing ship had to go around the tip of South America, and that was some very bad sailing many times of the year, and your chances of dying were pretty high on that voyage as well. So basically, again, you were sort of walking the entire distance. And you didn't have modern medical science to help you out if you did get a disease. So for many reasons, 10 or 15 people per mile sound, dead people per mile sounds like that's like a disaster. But in actual fact, again, over 90% probably of the people that actually went through the Oregon Trail, the other trails, actually made it to the other side and were successful in at least making it. And oftentimes, of course, they were even more successful when they got to their side by claiming land and becoming successful farmers or becoming successful business people in what we now know as Oregon. So by 1846, there had been this period when the United States and Britain had been sharing Oregon, and now a new president comes in office, James K. Polk, and he's wanting to annex Texas, and he's wanting to annex and bring in this Oregon area, but basically the British aren't really cooperating very much with the negotiations. They just sort of want to continue a joint occupation. So eventually, Polk and some of his friends start the phrase 54-40 or fight, and basically 54-40, that means you go up to the 54th parallel, 54 degrees, 40 minutes north latitude. That is, you're going north to a certain point. And basically, 54-40 or fight means we're going to take all of Oregon. You give us all of Oregon and we're going to fight. But in reality, this was more just to get British attention. So the British will come to the negotiating table and like make a fair deal. And indeed, in 1846, the British did sit down with the Americans. And again, they talked about their problems instead of fighting about them. And they decided, the Americans and the British, to divide the area up by the 49th parallel. So the 49th parallel was already part of the border further east, so they simply kept drawing that line out to the west. And that became the border between the United States and Canada that we currently have today. So the United States would acquire Oregon through a treaty with Britain in 1846. Just another example of how the United States has grown through a treaty. Of course, we again saw Florida through a treaty. We have seen how the United States has grown through purchases like the Louisiana Purchase, how we've grown through relocation of people like the Trail of Tears. We'll also see, as we move on this week and next week, more examples of how the United States has grown through those areas, but also how the United States has grown through warfare and conquest. So the Oregon Treaty of 1846, again, continued that 49th parallel, basically directly out. Of course, when you got to Vancouver Island, the British didn't want that island sort of split into two parts, so the Americans agreed to sort of go around the island, and that's why the little red line sort of dips around the island. But it's basically at the 49th parallel, which is where it is today, our current border with Canada.